And joining us right now as you watch the show on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, he is the co-host of the NBA podcast, also Forbes sports NBA writer. Bryan Toporek joins us right now on 97.3 ESPN. Bryan, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
Is that a fresh haircut I see?
It sure is. Yeah, I had to get it before the draft, before free agency. New year, new me. Gotta go.
New year, new you. Well, the good thing with the draft is I feel like this is not a diminishment of the wonderful night it was for all those young men and their families. But I feel like the biggest story of the draft wasn't actually anyone who was drafted per se. It was the fact that we had some level of normalcy. We actually had a draft. We actually had nothing virtual, none of that stuff we had to deal with last year. So to me, when Adam Silver said, it's so nice to see you people out here. Like, I kind of felt that, Bryan, because there's a part of you that's like, now that we've been able to see people like in person in recent months, there's a part of you that's like, wow, this is what it's really about. Like, it's not as much about specifically who drafted who, because that all kind of irons out in the end, right? It's the fact that we had some sort of normalcy with draft night.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's not short-lived, knock on wood, but I thought you were going to say the biggest story of draft night wasn't the draftees, but what the Lakers did, because that was...
That's true.
And the Woj and Shams battle that happened a couple hours before the draft started. But that, I think if you're looking ahead to next year specifically, because, most of the top prospects went to teams that are not even remotely close to championship contention. Like, if you're looking for what's the biggest story for next year, it was the Lakers acquiring Russell Westbrook.
Absolutely. And I think that what's interesting with the Lakers acquiring Russell Westbrook is that means they only have 4 guys under contract. So this is like LeBron Miami deja vu, where they literally had 4 or 5 guys under contract heading into each offseason. They had to finagle the cap. So Rob Pelinka is going to have to get really creative here because, I mean, I like the Russell Westbrook addition for the Lakers because, let's be realistic, Anthony Davis can't stay healthy and LeBron's getting older, so why not get a guy in there who basically is a workhorse to be out there on the court? But the problem is, who's he passing to?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I do not like the move whatsoever, especially given the rumors that were, I think it was Woj who said they were nearing, and Mark Stein of Substack, they were talking with Sacramento about a Buddy Hield acquisition. Right. And that, I think, given that they would have to give up less to get Hield and that he fits conceptually a little better in terms of, ideally, like, you pair LeBron and AD with just shooting. You just put a bunch of shooters around them and let LeBron be the point guard and pass to these guys. Russ, I agree. In the regular season, it could reduce the wear and tear on LeBron and AD, but he's such a historically bad shooter that once you get to the playoffs, every time teams are just going to go under screens on him. They're not going to respect him at all. So it might give them a higher floor during the regular season, but right now I think they have a lower ceiling than they would have with a Hield move. As you said, we'll see what happens in free agency. There's already some rumblings that, some guys might take less than they otherwise might expect to go join the Lakers and go pursue a championship with these guys. And if that's the case, like if we look back in a week and they've added, Reggie Bullock and Alec Burks and DeMar DeRozan on the mid-level exception, Otto Porter on a minimal contract, there are ways that they can build out this roster around these guys and still be the title favorites that we thought they were last year. But, right now, before free agency, after the draft, just knowing their roster is so barren, I do not feel very good about where the Lakers are.
So you mentioned free agency. What is free agency like this year? Because I feel like all of us are just kind of borderline overwhelmed right now in the sports world, which is the baseball trade deadline is this week. The NHL had their free agency this week. The NBA free agency is next week. The draft comes a week after the NBA finals at the same time of all the NFL reporting to camp. Like, for a regular sports fan, this is like the opposite of last year. Last year we had no sports for a while. Now it's sports overload, on top of everything else going on in the world. So, by the way, the Olympics are on TV. I saw a girl almost miss.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
By the way, I turned around. I saw a girl. She almost missed the board on the dive. So, I'm just like, oh my goodness. Like, I'm watching during the commercial break. I looked over. I'm like, did I just see that on live television? But anyway, so talk to everybody out there about what is free agency like this year for the NBA. Who are the legitimate guys to keep an eye on, and for lack of a better term, should they care about free agency?
Yeah, so I think, a year or two ago, you project ahead for a couple of years for free agency every year, and teams start building around. They're building long-term plans, seeing like, okay, all of these guys could be up at the same time. So a couple of years ago, it was like Giannis could be up for a new deal, LeBron could be up for a new deal, Paul George, Rudy Gobert, a couple like Jason Tatum, Bam Adebayo. All of those guys have signed extensions. So the top of the free agent class isn't nearly as strong as what we thought it was going to be. Kawhi Leonard is the number one prize on the market, but there have been no rumblings that he wants to leave the Clippers, and he's recovering from this partial ACL tear. So, I think he's going to get whatever contract he wants. I think Kevin Durant was proof of that a couple of years ago when the Nets still gave him a 4-year max off of an Achilles injury. Kawhi's injury, by all accounts, is not nearly as severe. So if Kawhi wants a 5-year max with the Clippers, I think he'll get it. Chris Paul is the other big name to keep an eye on. He has a $44.2 million player option. There's still no word yet if he's going to decline it, but it seems the wide assumption is that he is going to. Again, I don't see why he would leave the Phoenix Suns fresh off of that run to the finals. But if a team comes way over the top, like if the Suns aren't willing to offer him more than $60 million and someone else says, here's 120, that might get him to think twice. And then, otherwise, beyond Chris Paul, point guards are the strength of this free agent class. So you have Kyle Lowry, who's up, been discussed a ton with relation to the Sixers in particular. Mike Conley, Lonzo Ball, Spencer Dinwiddie, Dennis Schroeder. You have a couple of guys like Goran Dragic, Patty Mills, Derrick Rose, Devontae Graham. So it's like tiers of players, but just a ton of point guards on the market. And then other than that, it's mostly, like some run-of-the-mill, like 30-year-old DeMar DeRozan. Danny Green's a free agent who will be of interest to the Sixers again. Evan Fournier. No one like super, you bring this guy in, like Evan Fournier is not going to turn you into a title contender overnight, but we saw with the Hawks last year, if you sign a couple of those guys, maybe you can take a big step forward. So those are the big names. Not a ton of teams have cap space. It's like the Knicks, the Spurs, the Thunder can. The Mavericks are going to have around $30 million. The Pelicans can get up to 36. It sounds like a lot of these teams are lining up bids for Kyle Lowry in particular. So I think that is probably, Monday, 6 p.m. is when you can officially start negotiating with free agents. I think Lowry is the number one name to monitor when the clock strikes 6 to see, does he agree to a deal right away, or does he set a series of dominoes in motion?
Well, I think some of those dominoes could potentially impact the Sixers, because I'm assuming, and again, I'm assuming because I don't know for sure, obviously. I'm not Daryl Morey, but I'm assuming Simmons didn't get traded on draft night because the Sixers are banking on the fact that not every team's going to get all those point guards you mentioned. And as the market plays out, they'll be able to get involved in the market in some way. And as you mentioned, the Sixers would love to have Kyle Lowry. And at this point, I'm assuming that if you're going to get Kyle Lowry, you're trading Ben Simmons in some sort of sign and trade deal just because of the way the numbers work. And that's the only reason why, Brian, I can go with Ben Simmons hasn't been traded, because the free agent market is full of point guards. Because to me, and I have to agree with the other people who said this, because a lot of people on ESPN TV this week said, well, it makes sense if the Sixers trade him on draft night because you can get picks involved and it's easier to move assets around that way, for certain teams who might be interested. So I was thinking, all right, well, maybe there'll be a trade. And when you saw the Westbrook trade, you're like, okay, I saw one trade. Let's go Ben Simmons. And you're waiting around all night and nothing happens. And then Moore gets asked about it. He's like, oh, I'm not talking about that. It's like, thanks, Daryl. Thanks.
I didn't expect it to happen on draft night. I've been this entire offseason, I've been saying I don't even know if it happens at all this offseason. I think I've been less bullish on there is urgency right now to do this deal than a lot of other people in the Sixers Twitter space and who've been writing about the team. So I think it makes more sense to wait for free agency. You can't do a sign and trade with Kyle Lowry before that thing starts, and right now the draft is before free agency, so they couldn't have agreed to a Kyle Lowry centric deal on draft night just because that's not allowed. you're totally right. If they do a sign and trade with Kyle Lowry, one of Ben or Tobias almost has to go out. It's basically impossible to make the numbers work otherwise, just because they can't go over a certain threshold of money, about 143 million. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Is there a 2-team deal with like Lowry and Scotty Barnes, the new number 4 pick, going to the Sixers for Ben Simmons? Is it a 3-team deal where Simmons goes elsewhere, Lowry comes here, and that, I don't know what the mechanics are. We've been hearing a ton of leaks about, what Daryl has been asking for. Like Golden State, he wanted the 7-14 Wiggins Wiseman, but he also wanted 2 first-round picks. That was from Keith Pompey of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer said, they wanted like every pick under the sun from the Spurs. And that honestly tells me that Daryl is just like, probing the market right now, and he's setting outrageous prices. The way I keep making this analogy is, if you play fantasy football, there's always one owner out there who's just sending you like Duke Johnson for Christian McCaffrey.
Right.
And like, you're just praying that someone's like asleep at the wheel and it hits accept. So, if someone's willing to do this absurd package for Ben Simmons, that's great. But I think he really still wants to wait out and see what happens with Bradley Beal and Damian Lillard in particular. Beal, it sounds like, is happy about this Russ Westbrook trade. And I think the Wizards, as much as I dislike that deal for the Lakers, I actually like it a lot for the Wizards because it gives them more long-term flexibility. And I think they also just make more sense short-term. They need a point guard still, but Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report has been saying that a sign and trade with Spencer Dinwiddie seems to be in the works there. So that, I think that Wizards team is going to make a lot more sense on paper than it did last week. Dame, we don't know what is happening still. We'll see what Portland does, if they can re-sign Norman Powell in free agency, if they trade CJ McCollum somewhere. Jake mentioned a possible McCollum for Pascal Siakam swap has been discussed. So, if Portland can't make the moves that satisfy Dame, does he request a trade in a month or two? And this is what I keep coming back to with Ben, is that you don't want to take 50 cents on the dollar right now if you think there's a chance that Damian Lillard becomes available in 3 months, because that, Ben alone is not going to get you Damian Lillard. But if you package Ben with, picks, some of these young guys on the roster, that can probably at least get you in the door.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on Sports Bash Saturday, 97.3 ESPN FM, at @BToporek on Twitter. You can check out the NBA podcast, download on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever you listen to your podcast. Subscribe, download. Also writes for Forbes Sports NBA contributor. Now, if I could play devil's advocate with the Damian Lillard thing, because I'm on the Damian Lillard, he's not getting traded this offseason train. I think that Portland's going to find a way to satiate him. And my question then is, if you wait around for what may never happen and you miss out on another opportunity, you're still stuck in the same boat. Is it worth being stuck in the same boat because you waited for Lillard and it never happened? Or is it better off just saying, look, we'll take Kyle Lowry, we'll take whoever else comes in a 3-way deal, and moving forward with those guys?
Yeah, I think that's the question that Daryl has to weigh. Are you willing to risk being left with Ben Simmons? If Dame doesn't become available, if Beal doesn't become available, these chairs are all going to move around in the next week or two. And after that, these big trades might not be available. So you have to basically decide what is, the lowest threshold that you're willing to accept right now, and accept the risk that if you take this, that might take you out of the running for Dame, and it might take you out of the running for Beal. But, the packages that were being discussed before the draft didn't really make sense for where the Sixers are as a team. That, why do the Sixers want James Wiseman when they have Joel Embiid?
Right.
Those types of packages, seem to imply that they would be trading Ben for assets that they would then immediately offload in one of these superstar trades. So, I think the question really is, are you willing to go into next season with Ben Simmons on your roster? If you are, then you're willing to wait out a Beal possible trade, a Dame possible trade, maybe Zach LaVine from Chicago. Then you can have a little bit more time to, wait this thing out. If you say there is no going back by training camp, we absolutely need Ben Simmons off the roster, you're going to have to lower your asking price. Like, because you're right. There's no guarantee that Beal or Dame get moved this offseason. I think it's more likely than not that they don't. I think both of those guys are going to go into next season, and maybe then if things fall apart, that's moved, or next offseason for Dame in particular. So that's why you hire someone like Daryl Morey, because it's a really tough decision to make. And I'm sure he's going to be on the phone all weekend trying to figure out what's best for this team, and what's the best offer he can get now versus what's the intel coming out of Washington and Portland about, are these guys going to become available anytime soon?
Big picture question about the league this offseason. What is the impact of the Bucks winning the championship on this offseason? Because, I had Miran Fader on last week. We talked about her book about Giannis, and her and I talked about the fact that, Giannis winning a championship changes the perception for fans, for example, of, like, to me, I believe there should be an Antetokounmpo jersey on everyone's back right now. Like, everybody, like, oh, you talk about you missed old school basketball, right? You should be a fan of Giannis. There should be 1 million Giannis jerseys sold. Everybody should love this guy. But what is the impact on the league, Brian? What is the impact around the league saying, hey, this guy stayed in Milwaukee. Milwaukee made the difficult trades this offseason. They bit the bullet and kept the coach. Like, they did everything, and they wound up with a championship. So what is the impact on the league this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, if you're Washington and Portland, that's probably the hope. You point to Giannis and tell Bradley Beal, hey, he stayed and won, and look at how rewarding it was for him. Or tell Dame the same thing. So all of these small market teams with superstars, even New Orleans, where we're already hearing reports that Zion and members of his family might not be happy. Like, all of these places are going to tell their superstars, look, you can go chase the easy way, go form a super team. Like, that's your choice, but it's, if you work and work and work and build your way up, and, the community's going to love you forever. Like, there's going to be a Chris Middleton statue and a Bobby Portis statue outside of somewhere in Milwaukee, just because those guys were so important to that title run. So what's the impact? Like, I don't think that Beal or Dame is looking at that and is saying, oh, well, if he can do it, I can. Because Milwaukee, they fell short in the playoffs for the last couple of years, but they had the best record in the league, not this year, but the 2 prior years. So it's like they were a title contender for the last 3 years, and they finally just broke through this year. Washington was barely a playoff team this year. Portland, made it to the Western Conference Finals 2 years ago, has gotten knocked out in the first round in the 2 years since, lost to a very badly injured Denver Nuggets team this year. So I think, you can tell these guys, look, it's rewarding to win where you're drafted and the community is going to love you. But at the same time, the front office, the ownership has to actually do a good job and build well around these guys. Because after a certain point, when you're in a small market and you're not a major free agent destination, if you make too many mistakes, then there is a point of no return where it makes sense that, like, you're not going to ever get to that title contender status. So you might have to think about trading your stars before it is too late. And I think Portland is in a really interesting spot this offseason because they have so many guys on expiring contracts where this would be the natural pivot point. Like, if you're going to trade Dame, this is the best offseason to do it, because you're risking losing a lot of free agents out the door next summer, and he still might request a trade. But we'll see what happens. I would be surprised if those guys are looking at Giannis and they're like, oh, okay, well, now we're happy in our markets, because Portland and Washington are in very different spots roster-wise than where Milwaukee was even prior to this season.
He's Bryan Toporek. Give him a follow on Twitter at @BToporek. Of course, he's the co-host of the NBA podcast. Download, subscribe, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever else. I mean, I feel like there's like 20 podcast platforms now at this point. Yeah. But obviously, you can get them on all the platforms. Also, check out his work over on Forbes Sports. And he joined us here on the live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter with a fresh haircut. So Bryan is ready for the NBA offseason visually and mentally. here as we get ready. Next week is when it all starts going down. And, of course, Bryan will join us again in the near future to recap the latest and greatest. Bryan, always appreciate you jumping on. Enjoy the weekend and get some sleep, hydrate, because you're going to need it for next week.
I'm trying to. I will say I've got a Sixers free agent preview coming out tomorrow on Forbes, so check that out if you're interested. Lots of taxpayer mid-level minimum signing guys that they should be going after.
So basically all the technical stuff people need to know about before they throw out their harebrained ideas on Twitter.
Yep, that's the hope. Yep.
Great stuff, Bryan. We'll check it out tomorrow. Thanks, man.
Cool. Thank you.